Thanks, Brad, and good morning. And also, thank you, Brad, for this once-in-a-lifetime chance, which is to one-up Susan Carey. I'm not sure I'll get that again. In fact, I've always thought that in another life I could have been a hard-hitting reporter, and so today I'll get my chance to play one for just a little while. I'm honored to stand in for one of the best. We'll miss Susan's presence today, but I'll certainly do my best to pinch hit, even posing a few of her handcrafted questions. And in fact, if you're listening carefully, you just might recognize which of those questions are Susan's and which of those are mine. In any event, I'm glad we're here. I'm enthusiastic about moderating this panel because the issue could not be of more importance to the regional airline industry. The growing shortage of commercial airline pilots is a problem to industry that is nothing short of stunning. The phrase "a perfect storm" has become cliched. We aviation types have certainly beat that drum a heck of a lot recently, but sometimes a cliche is so because it's remarkably apt. In this case, the phrase is not just accurate, it feels painfully fitting. If we look at all the disparate forces at work right now, we can easily see a walloping storm on the horizon. In a nutshell, we've got 500,000 pilots that we'll need in the next 2 decades, and the FAA is issuing far fewer pilot certificates than it has in decades past. We expect a big wave of age 65 retirements to start to hit hard and soon. Of course, the major airlines, as they replenish their supply of pilots, they'll continue to look to the regional airlines for the best and most capable aviators. They can and will and do hire from us. So just to offer some perspective, the 4 largest network carriers in the next 8 years are expected to retire 18,000 pilots. And that exceeds the total number of regional aviation pilots in our entire workforce. If that weren't enough, we have federal rules, new rules, that require most pilots to have 1,500 hours, give or take, depending on where and how you've gotten your training, in their logbooks. This has raised the cost, it's raised the duration of training for would-be pilots, and it's forcing some of them to seriously consider whether or not they'll go on. Of course, pilot pay at regional airlines has become a familiar talking point for many. The first-year, first officer wages in particular have earned intense scrutiny. Along with this, the role of collective bargaining has also come into question. Finally, the FAA has issued new pilot duty and rest rules. This was an important measure, and RAA embraced it. But it's forced airlines to pad their ranks by about 5%. You've heard it from Roger, you just heard it from Brad, and now you hear it from me. The Regional Airline Association is spending a lot of time on this issue. We're worried about it. But now let me introduce our panel of experts. They'll discuss this weighty topic in all of its aspects. Dan Akins is an aviation economist with 30 years experience, and he's taken a deep dive on this subject, weighing the airline, labor, and training perspectives and producing data-heavy reports that illustrate the problem with an exacto knife's precision. Andrew Von Ah has led work on pilot workforce issues for the Congressional Watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. In February, the GAO published a much-anticipated report on the subject, looking at the pilot workforce. While the report characterized its findings as mixed, it highlighted many issues and important challenges associated with the pilot shortage. And it talked about service implications that are already taking place. Last but not least, although he needs little introduction to this crowd, we have with us Brian Bedford, CEO since 1999, one of the largest regional airline groups, Republic Airways Holdings. Brian is already living with the consequences of the shortage, having removed 27 of Republic's 250 aircraft from service due to the lack of qualified pilots. Brian is chairman of our task force, as you heard from Brad, and he shared his views in that capacity on the pilot shortage before Congress last month. So the panel will take your questions at the end of the presentation, so I hope you'll give them your best shot. In the meantime, I'll get things rolling by asking our 3 distinguished panelists to each give a brief overview of how they see the workforce issue today, why it's having the biggest effect right here on regional airlines, and what they believe will be the state of play in the next 5 or 10 years. Dan, will you start?
Thanks, Faye, and thank you for having us here today to talk about this important topic. All of us are familiar with the situation that we find ourselves in this industry. If you read the headlines from financial papers and inside airline publications, 2014 is supposed to be one of the most profitable periods in aviation history, followed by an even more profitable 2015. So we all are aware of what can go wrong with those kinds of forecasts. Usually it's from exogenous events, usually things that no one can put into their business plan affect everyone's business plan. Obviously, the largest of which in the past 2 decades was 9/11. That was followed by wars and SARS, fuel price spikes, economic collapse. However, the thing we're talking about today is something that's within our power to control. It's on the radar screen. It's a hurricane that is now just coming on shore. The depths and dimension and the strength of the winds in those hurricanes are unknown, and it's up to us to prepare and react and to position ourselves to, for once, control the events that are going to dictate the next 10 years of industry prosperity. I was going to talk a little bit about the historical structure of the industry. I think you guys, it's too early in the morning, you'd probably fall asleep. I think one of the big issues today that we find ourselves in is that there's a structural problem based on the system that pilots are trained in this country. And if you look at the way foreign carriers train pilots, many of them send their pilot cadets to U.S. flight schools for training in the Southwest where the weather is favorable, and they're sponsored by their companies or their countries to train cadet pilots in a response to a lack of pilot supply in the indigenous countries because they don't have a big enough military or they don't have as active a civilian population to produce enough commercial pilots. So there is a solution out there. We haven't practiced that solution. We haven't had to practice that solution since the late 1970s. There's been a surplus of pilots available. And to some extent, the industry's been spoiled by a surplus of pilots. We've offloaded the training expense onto either the backs of the military or the students themselves. And we're starting to see the effects of a lack of people willing to undertake that expense. And I think the discussion today should really center around the causes and solutions, I hope, so that we don't walk out of here kind of scratching our heads trying to figure out what do we do next. So I think part of what I've learned in 30 years of consulting, I started out at ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, as an economic analyst. So when I speak to groups about this problem, I want to talk about the supply from a pilot's perspective and talk about, since 9/11, what the marketplace looked like for a pilot and why there aren't any pilots in flight schools to fulfill the demand that I see on the horizon. The very predictable demand based on the seniority lists and aging out of pilots. This isn't a guess, this is actual precision. Sort of people that are age 63 today are going to be 65 in 2 years. So we know who's going to hit the age 65 retirement. On top of that, there's going to be more than 18,000 because there's going to be people that leave the profession before age 65. ALPA did a study to show that it's around 63 and a half in terms of the number of the age that people leave the profession. But getting back to the facts, there have been 3 major changes in FAA regulations and public law that we're now dealing with that we weren't dealing with a few years ago. That's laid on top of a marketplace since 9/11, where pilots in the industry have seen tens of thousands of furloughs, carriers go bankrupt, mergers and acquisitions, and generally a very risky and unfavorable environment to be a pilot. The pilots that remained in the industry, at least in the mainline carriers, saw concessions, pensions lost, risk of bankruptcy or cessation of their carriers. So there's a whole confluence of events that if you're sitting as a prospective pilot in the United States looking at training as a pilot, it doesn't look throughout the 2000s as a very good prospect for you. And that's part of the market overlay. As we got out of the recession, we got back on our feet, the airline business started making money in 2006, 7, and 8. What did we have? Fuel price spike, and we had an age 65 rule that changed the dynamics of a stagnant market, which was, as the market was beginning to develop an interest in new pilots and grow, we had our knees knocked out from under us with things that, again, were from outside the industry. At the end of the day, we had another 5 years of stagnation. Again, looking at it from a pilot's perspective, regional pilots stayed within the regionals, mainline pilots traded out after age 65, obviously they had to leave, but we had this problem where, again, the prospects of being a new pilot to get hired weren't based on concessions, but actually the lack of jobs available in the industry that were attractive. I think there are a number of solutions out there to solve this. It's not a simple solution. We have to regain some type of linkage between the airlines themselves, the training of cadet pilots that they want to employ at some time in the future, and that's sort of a business issue, and also dealing with some ways to deal with regulatory change that I think is going to be much worse in the next few years than it is today. And I think Brian mentioned something in an article about we're in the bottom of the first inning, and we are in the bottom of the first inning. I didn't expect this to be happening until 2017. It's with us today. Like the moniker says, the impacts are real. And so I'm very interested to hear your questions. As Faye said, I've done a lot of research, analytical research on this topic, and I'd like to discuss that with you further. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew, will you share your perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Faye. Thanks for inviting me to sit here on the panel and discuss our report with you all. We've been sitting with this issue for the last year or so, talking to all the regional airlines, talking to a number of different stakeholder groups, looking at all the data that's available. And our report's findings often get sort of characterized as, mixed, and that was sort of part of a couple of our headings that said mixed evidence of such and such and so on. But the question of whether there's a shortage or not, whether we found a shortage or not, is not really an issue. I mean, we did find a shortage, and the shortage was for first officers at regional airlines, and that's a very real shortage. And in talking to folks like Brian and others in the room, that there's a real impact to that, and it impacts service, and it is sort of something that needs to be addressed. Where things become a little more mixed or unclear is when you look at how big of a problem this is going to be, what are the sort of implications industry-wide, what's going to happen with the majors, what's going to happen 5 years down the line. Because I think, as Dan was sort of mentioning, there's been a shift in sort of demand signals for pilots over the last 15 years or so. There haven't been a lot of jobs available. Airlines have just sort of been replacing attrition, and you've had about somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pilots on average hired a year. And now you're looking at a situation where you're looking to hire 2,000 to 4,000 a year over the next decade or so. If you look at all the forecasts and kind of congeal them down into their essence, that's kind of what they all say. And so now you've got a situation where you've got large pools out there of certificate holders in various stages of their career. You got pilot certificates or student pilot certificates and private pilot certificate holders and commercial pilot certificate holders, etc., who are going to then start to move through. And so the question is whether these pools are large enough, and this is a question that we get asked from our Hill clients quite a bit. Are these pools large enough to address that demand? If you look at the numbers straight up, I mean, yes, there are these large pools of certificate holders, and the question really is whether they're incentivized and have, sort of see a career path and see a way forward that they can, that it makes sense for them to pursue that kind of a career, pursue that next certificate, and get the hours that they need to get to that stage. So, I think that's, there are two sort of main factors that we kind of came to understand are sort of were the big things to consider here. And one was obviously the wages that they're going to be facing at the early part of their career, how long they face those wages before they can start to repay what is becoming a mounting student debt for many pilots coming out of pilot school. And so, these are two issues that I think clearly have to be addressed in some way. The regulatory issues where we're talking about sort of having to have more hours simply exacerbates the problem, because now you've got a longer period of time where you're at basically entry-level wages and a higher cost to get to that level, certificate level, that allows you to sort of be, continue in that airline pilot career. So those were the sort of the main issues that we found, and I think, as was mentioned, there are several ways to deal with those kinds of issues. We brought them up in our report. We didn't make any recommendations, but this was something that we sort of laid out some options for Congress to consider, and we'll see what they do in the next months.
Brian, will you share your thoughts?
Thank you, Faye, and good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to come at this slightly differently, so bear with me just a second. I love telling stories. So Dan has, I think, laid out articulately all the reasons why you don't want to become an airline pilot. Andrews said it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to become an airline pilot. So I'll just tell a little bit of a story here. So I graduated from high school in 1979, and I couldn't afford to go to college, so I went to work at our local Piper aircraft manufacturing plant in Lakeland, Florida as a production scheduler. And after 2 years, I was able to save up enough money to go to school, and went to Florida State University, go Noles, and got into the airline business in 1987 with Continental Airlines, and all on the sort of the finance and accounting side. So not an operations guy, not a pilot guy, but those couple of years I was with the Piper aircraft, I always had that bug about thinking about becoming a pilot. Now I'm in the airline business, and it's 1993, and I'm in my first CEO job at Business Express, and tough situation, but it was a restructuring process, and it required us to sit down with the Airline Pilots Association and negotiate a concessionary contract, which was no fun. But all I kept hearing from the pilots is, you just don't understand what it's like to be a pilot. You can't appreciate what we go through. You don't understand the sacrifices